All right, howdy folks. Since book tour and conventions have been put on hold, I figured I'd bring book tour to you. So welcome to Russ's Rockin' Rollercoaster, intriguing interviews with creative minds. We love to read and watch stories about crime and criminals, but how much is reality and how much is just made up to tell a good story? That's what we'll be discussing tonight as former law enforcement officers turned authors, say that 3 times fast, walk us through CSI cops and crime fiction. On our panel is my good friend, John French, a retired crime scene investigator from Baltimore with over 40 years experience. John is also a short story writer and editor who specializes in pulp and crime stories, which can be found in the excellent collection, The Last Redhead, while his current projects include novels featuring Frankenstein and Dracula, the anthology Horns and Halos, in which I also have a story, and Mortal Sins. Hello, John.
Hi, Russ. Hi, Bruce, Quentin. How's everybody out there doing?
All right, great. Okay, also on our panel is Quentin Peterson, a former Washington, D.C. police officer, where he served as liaison officer with the media and members of the motion picture and television industries, acting as a script consultant and technical advisor. Quentin has written 4 D.C.-based crime novels, Sin, The Wages of Sin, Guarding Shakespeare, and its sequel, The Voynich Gambit, and is a contributor to multiple short story anthologies. Hello, Quentin.
Hey, Russ. Hey, guys. How you guys doing?
All right. All right. Great to see you. And last but not least, Bruce Coffin is a former detective sergeant, having supervised all homicide and violent crime investigations for Maine's largest city, and following 9/11, spent 4 years investigating counterterrorism cases for the FBI, my old job. He is also the award-winning author of the Detective Byron Mysteries and contributed short fiction to multiple anthologies, including Best American Mystery Stories of 2016. Hello, Bruce.
Hey, Russ, how are you?
All right.
Thanks for having me on.
Oh, no, it's great. All right. So for those of you who are watching at home, feel free to send me questions and comments in the chat box for our panel throughout the hour, and we'll get to some at the end of the show. All right. We've got a lot to get into. But first, before you guys joined law enforcement at the beginning of your career, I want to know, what did you think it was going to be like? And how did that compare to how it was actually like? Bruce, let's start with you.
Oh, geez. Really, my experience with that was my getting to see what my uncle was up to, because he was a cop in a small town near where I lived for 36 years, I think he did in total. And really, other than what I saw of him, my idea of police work was what I saw on television and radio, not radio, television and movies, like everybody. I think the big lie back when we first started, I remember when I was looking into being a police officer and found out that I had an oral interview with the department I ended up working for, was, they said they're going to ask you why you want to be a police officer. And I thought, Jesus, talk about a loaded question. I have no idea. I don't want to tell them it's because I want to drive fast and carry a badge, a shiny badge, and a gun, right? I don't want to tell them the truth. And so the old timers would all say, tell them you want to help people. That's why you want to be a police officer. And that happened to everybody. It was generational. And the big joke was that we thought we were pulling a fast one. And the reality was, the truth was that we wanted to help people. And it took you about 3 months to figure out that that's exactly why cops become cops. So I found that funny. And that lie probably is still told, but the joke is always on the officer, because you realize quickly that's the only thing about the job that keeps you coming back.
Oh, that's great. Quentin, what about you?
Well, I knew it was going to be dangerous. And I knew it was going to be exciting. And the only thing I had to go on, like he said, TV shows and movies, Adam 12. And, I figured, I'm built for this. I can do this. I can actually serve the community. And when I got into it, it was dangerous. But I realized there was a necessary job. Somebody's got to do it. And I fit in. I was built for it. So that's the only difference is I couldn't imagine what it was going to actually be like to be a police officer. I just knew I wanted to be one and help my community.
All right. What about you, John? You had a very different kind of law enforcement experience.
Right. When I learned that I'd been accepted actually, it was during my interview, I found out that what I thought was going to be a laboratory job where I would be seeing evidence in the lab, using those techniques I had learned in college, was actually going out on crime scenes and collecting the evidence and all that. That was a bit of a shock, but also, I said, all right, well, I can do this. And, and I continue to do it for 40 years.
Right. All right. So let me ask you, fellas. So there's a certain seduction to crime fiction, but crime is often brutal. Why do you think we're drawn to crime fiction in the first place? John, let's go back to you.
I think it's because in most crime fiction, there's at least in the early days and all that, it was good guys versus bad guys. Guys won. There was a certain order, or at least initially there was chaos, and then the detective, be they an amateur detective or a private eye or a police officer or detective, they would come in and restore order to the way it was, to the way things were. Now it's more, I think people see it as kind of a slice of life. It's a lot of crime fiction these days is reflective of the society and the world we live in, where there's less black and white and more shades of gray.
Quentin, what about you?
Well, I think people like crime fiction because for the most part, like stories I write, you find justice in them. You don't find justice too often in life. I know I didn't on the police department. So to actually see a story go down where you're going to find some justice in the end, where people are going to get what they deserve. And I think that's why people read crime fiction, basically, is to find justice.
Bruce?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's absolutely true. The one thing about real life is that we don't have the control over it we wish we did. I think that the nice thing about crime fiction is just that it gives you an opportunity to set the world right again. And in real life, as both of these guys can tell you, you work and you get invested in some very emotional cases, and you feel for the victim. And unfortunately, we don't always get the justice that we're after, that we're seeking for them and their surviving relatives. So the nice thing about fiction is the fact that we can take what we've learned and weave that into a story where justice will be served. And I think that's a nice escape from reality. Sometimes there's way too much reality in our day-to-day lives, and it's nice to be able to escape into that world maybe we all wish we lived in.
Well, before I think there's a lot there for all you guys are saying, but I want to say before we go on, and it needs to be said, at least by me, the job that you guys did is something that Quentin, you said you were built for it. I'm not. In 1 million years, there's no way I could have ever been a law enforcement officer. I'm just not. I don't have it in me. So I thank you for everything that you guys did, because it's important work and it needs to be done. And it was never going to be me. So I'm eminently grateful for folks like you who did the real tough stuff. So I just want to thank you for that. All right. So John, so here's something, I thought about this one. This is a special one for you. So as the resident CSI expert, forensics has obviously become a significant component of crime investigation. But how much of what we see in shows like CSI in particular is real, and how much is it pure Hollywood cool factor?
Well, I don't watch CSI. Despite the fact that, thanks to Pat Thomas, one of my books was a prop on one of the CSI shows. I don't watch it. I watched the first episode, and my wife really hates it when I scream at the television. A lot of what they do is real life. I mean, I've gotten a fingerprint off a drinking straw. I've gotten a fingerprint off a leaf.
Off a leaf, really?
Off a leaf, yes. We can digitally scan crime scenes and do a 3D walkthrough. A lot of their toys, or as we call them, are real. It's just that their procedures are crap. And a lot of what you see, for instance, I know Quentin and Bruce will tell me, you never will agree with me, you never put evidence in a plastic bag.
Right.
But on television, if you put evidence in a paper bag, nobody can see the gun or the knife that you hold up. And there's sort of a carelessness about the handling of evidence. If Quentin, Bruce, and I were on a TV show, and I'm sure we'd all watch that one. Quentin's the officer on the scene. Bruce is the detective. I'm the crime lab, and Quentin finds the knife, or that Bruce finds the knife, and he just hands it to Quentin and says, "Take this to John in the crime lab." And none of it, that knife's not going to be admitted because there is no chain of custody. So there's a laxity about that. And plus there is I don't know if it's willful ignorance or what, but a lot of the shows, particularly a show I still watch, Law and Order, they have a limited view on what the crime lab can do. Law and Order never did learn that you can match a cartridge case to a gun, as opposed to just the bullets that the gun fired.
So let me ask. So you said about you don't put evidence in a plastic bag. What do you put it in?
Paper bag.
It's paper.
Paper. If you put, for particularly like evidence such as that has blood on it, if you seal it in a plastic bag, you've got it'll degrade. And if you put bloody clothes in a plastic bag, when you open that plastic bag, you will clear out the floor that the crime lab is on, because you've got putrefaction. You put it in a paper bag because paper, air can flow through paper, and it at least, no pun intended, arrests the putrefaction.
Oh, there you go. Right on. Okay, so I'm going to switch to the other side. So Bruce and Quentin. So, and John, feel free to jump in as well, but Bruce and Quentin. So the stories that we write and read about about cops and detectives necessitate a mystery of some kind. When you investigated crime, when you were on the streets, you were in the field, did you treat your investigations as true mysteries, or was it more, mechanical? It was a job to be done.
For me, it was mechanical. A lot of times there was no mystery. I knew who did it right there. The person was there because it'd be a crisscross. They'd wound each other. Or one would be wounded and the other one would be dead. Or there'd be witnesses telling me what happened. Or it was a family disturbance where you called to the house because of violence going on in a family, within a family, at their home. So I didn't come across a lot of mysteries, not me.
Bruce?
Yeah, I think at the beginning of my career, I think there was more of that, what Quentin just described. As time went on and we did more cases, there were actually, the murders tended to go away from the family dynamic, which really made it much harder to deal with. I think what ends up happening is really you try to treat those as a mystery so that you don't quickly tunnel down to the one obvious suspect. That's always the fear in that kind of stuff, where you don't have you may not have camera footage of the thing, or you might not have reliable witnesses. You have to resist the urge to jump too quickly in the direction that things tell you they're going necessarily. You want to try to keep an open mind so that you don't miss that there is other things there. That's really one of those things that ends up getting used against you in a trial. That if you too quickly focus down on the one suspect, then you're ignoring everything else. So a lot of times we really would kind of play devil's advocate when we would discuss the progress of the case, because everybody coming to the table brought something different. We all had our own different life experiences. We all had our own biases and history within the police department. So a lot of times you just throw something out, that if you found evidence that didn't tend to support the main theory, you might throw something out that would point or suggest something different, just so that people kind of kept that open mind until you finally excluded everybody else and were left with the suspect.
So let me ask you, so following up on that, so almost going the other way, did you guys ever work on cases where, for whatever reason, it really kind of just affected you emotionally, and you kind of really got sucked into it to the point where it did blind you a little bit, and you were sort of overlooking maybe process or procedure that sort of took you away from where you needed to be? Or were you able kind of throughout to just say, well, this is some tough stuff, but I'm just sticking to the plan and I'm going to get to where I need to get to?
I was fortunate in that you'd be on a crime scene with some, horrific elements, or just some sad elements, like young couple just starting out. They saved up to get a TV, and then while they were out, somebody comes in and steals the TV, and they're basically, all their money went into the TV, and it's sad. But you do the best, as a crime scene investigator, you do the best possible job, but you seldom see the results of that job. So, I mean, I'll do everything I can on the scene, but then I get to turn it over to people like Quentin and Bruce to solve the mystery.
Bruce?
Yeah, occasionally. I can give you one that was a real good example. We investigated the disappearance of a young woman who disappeared from Portland's Old Port after a night of dancing and hanging out with friends. And we weren't able to find her body for about a month and a half. And there were two really good suspects in this. And until we were able to discount and prove that one of them hadn't done it, it was really hard to focus on anything other than those two. And it really did get personal. We're real good at putting up that defense wall and the armor that you build up over time, and not letting cases like that get personal. But this girl was one of those that you don't get a lot of victims where they don't do dumb things that put themselves in harm's way. Their lifestyle is a little different. And she was that type of a girl where she really just was a total victim in this case. And it was real easy for us to project, our own families, our own daughter kind of thing into that situation. So it was much harder to keep the shield up and not let that get to us emotionally.
Quentin, how about you?
Well, there was this case where somebody did a ride-by shooting on a bicycle. They rode by on a bicycle, shot at some other drug dealers. He was a young boy, like 13. I won't give out his name, but everybody was looking for him, the people he fired at and the police. And we finally found him. Found him in an open field, dead of winter. And he had his head blown off. And then he was in a puddle of water. So he was half in and half out of a puddle of water. It was water when they shot him, and then it froze. So half of him was in this frozen little puddle, and the other half, we had to stay there with tents, and they'd use heating elements to release him from the ice. And that image, being there watching that, it wakes me up sometime at night.
Wow.
That young boy wasted his life like that.
Wow. That's intense. About a month or so ago, I had Mark Olshaker on the show. Mark, I don't know if you know Mark, who wrote the Mindhunter book, that became the series. And we did a lot of talking. If you've ever read the book, and I read it and we talked about it, about how the criminal mind, we're not talking about someone who just kind of winds up doing something stupid, but the criminal mind does not, someone who falls into that legitimate category, they just don't think the way normal people think. Their worldview is completely skewed, almost in an alternate reality, where they just think, they're always either the victim or they're always entitled. Did you encounter a lot of that, or was it just kind of a lot of, look, a lot of crime is dealing with, crimes of necessity or passion? Or what was your experience with the kinds of people that you came across? Bruce?
I can honestly say that, luckily we didn't deal with a lot of sociopaths, which I think is really what you're describing. They're very high intelligence, people that could go back and do that kind of thing over and over again. The case I just mentioned to you, I think that was a sociopath in the making. We were lucky that we put a stop to that with the first killing. But I think a lot of them tend to not be that way. And one of the nice things about that is that these aren't people that actually think this stuff through, and they're not, they may be career criminals, but they're not career murderers. And so they make dumb mistakes, probably the same dumb mistakes that we would make, and we would know better because we know what the police look for. But I think by and large, most of those, we were lucky because they would do dumb things or not understand what it is we were going to do for a job, and they'd leave a trail behind that they didn't intend.
Right. Quentin, how about you?
No masterminds. No sociopaths I've dealt with personally. The stuff I did when I was on the street is just the basic run-of-the-mill. Somebody trying to get something because they had nothing. Not somebody sitting back thinking some evil thing to do like 7 or something like that. Nobody I haven't counted anybody like that.
Okay, so I want to ask you guys something. This is sort of, in crime fiction, the private detective is a classic archetype. But how often did you actually encounter private detectives? And if you did, what was your relationship with them?
Okay. I probably had less contact with private investigators than Quentin or Bruce, but the one time I knew there was a private investigator involved in one of my cases, it was a drive-by at a house. This guy was having a dispute with somebody, and he drove by and he put 445 bullets into the front door. And there was a storm door, so we were able to do some trajectory and reverse trajectory and find the cartridge cases, which impressed the hell out of these officers standing by. But the defense brought in a private investigator who was supposed to be an expert in crime scene reconstruction and trajectory and all that, and they put him on the stand. Now, I was not allowed in the courtroom because I was one of the other witnesses, but they brought in one of the Baltimore City firearms units as a rebuttal witness, and he just tore the guy a new one. It was so bad that after the voir dire of the so-called expert witness, the judge would only allow him to say that, yeah, I showed up, I looked at the holes, I took some pictures.
Bruce, how about you?
Yeah, I didn't deal with it a lot, but when we did, it really kind of it wasn't the warmest of relationships. And I think primarily for what John was just talking about, a lot of times where you're dealing with a private investigator as a police officer, they are brought in by defense. They may be the bad guy's attorney that has hired them or whatever. And of course, their job is not to necessarily search for the truth, but to search for their truth. So a lot of times that becomes a problem. And then I know another one that the other type that bothered me were if you had a case that we were unable to solve or we had not solved yet, and it felt like it was taking too long, a lot of times the family would, out of frustration, try to bring somebody in to feel like they were actually doing something. And, obviously I can't speak for all. I'm sure there's plenty of good ones out there, but it always felt exploitative to me for them to be doing that, throwing money after something that, trust me, the police were definitely trying to solve. So it wasn't necessarily the warmest of relationships for us.
So I want to ask you guys something. So another classic element of crime fiction is having the hero, right? Whether it's the beat cop, the detective, the private eye, what have you, they put themselves and thus their loved ones in danger, right? To hide the heightened drama. Is that a fictional concept? Or did you ever feel like the criminals, maybe were going to come driving by your house and come looking for you?
I got a death threat once, but that actually was at my home, but that got resolved fairly quickly. That was over 40 years, and it was never, as far as I know, it never got, other than that, it was never personal. I was just a crime lab guy. And the way it works in the crime lab is if illness or vacation or something else kept me from testifying, there were other people qualified to testify as to my report. Same thing with latent prints and all that. So taking out the crime lab guy or the crime lab girl doesn't really help anything.
How about you guys, Quentin?
Well, I haven't gotten any threats, but there was this one time I was out with my son. He must have been 7 or 8, and we went to this carryout. He wanted some kind of sub or something, so that good dad got a sub. When we came out, this guy yelled at me, "Hey, you don't know me, you don't remember me, do you?" I was like, "Oh hell, what the hell's going on? Is somebody ever arrested? What's going to happen?" And I had my gun inside of his coat with no pocket. I could open, sling open the coat and shoot. So I had my hand on my gun. So he said, "You don't remember me, do you?" I said, "No." He said, "I remember you." He pulled out his hand real fast. I almost shot him. He wanted to shake my hand.
Oh,
He said, "You don't remember me?" And he gave me the date. He said it was I arrested him in the 2nd district. And out of all the people there, I was the only one that treated him like a man.
Yeah.
And he wanted to thank me for that.
wow.
And I just knew he was there to kill me and hurt my son. I just knew it. And if I had a split second, I could have shot this guy trying to thank me because I was afraid for my son.
Wow.
So I'm glad, thinking about it, give me chills because I could have just easily shot him as soon as he made that quick move with his hand. Because he could have been coming out with a gun, and I didn't want my son to get hurt.
Wow.
But
Wow.
no threats or anything like that. I just, sometimes you run across people you arrest, and I always treated people like human beings. "No, ma'am. Yes, sir." I didn't call them names. I said, "Look, don't be angry with me. I didn't do this. You did this. You committed the crime. You got caught. Nothing personal." And I'd give them a Coke or something. I said, "I'm not giving you coffee. You might throw it in my face." But I always give them a nice soft drink or something to talk to them, treat them like people. And it got me through.
Wow. How about you, Bruce?
A lot of threats over the years, but very, very few did I ever take seriously. That especially when you're making the arrest, people will say all kinds of stuff, threaten you, threaten your family. But like I say, there's a big difference between hearing somebody shoot their mouth off and actually taking seriously what they're saying, because they need the wherewithal to be able to follow up.
Right. So
If I can add to something Quentin said about, treating people with respect and, instead of calling them, I'll just use Russ as an example because he looks kind of like a shady guy. Instead of just saying, "Well, Russ, we want to do this," and "Russ, we're going to do that." It was always because, I was, crime lab. I was there to take his fingerprints or there to take his picture. And it was always, "Mr. Colchamiro, I'm from the crime lab. I'm going, I had to take your picture. Would you please do this? And thank you," and all that. I treated him as a person instead of like a murder suspect or something like that. And one of the things that will always stay with me is I did this one night. And the guy was, he was arrested for murder. He was on his way to central booking, and I photographed him before he left. And I called him Mr. and thanked him and sir and all this. And before he left, he says, "I want to thank you." He said, "You're probably the last person who will call me Mr. the next 20 years.
wow.
And that just kind of showed me how important it was to treat everyone with respect.
Wow. Wow. So along those lines, it's a good segue for my next question. So another common trope in crime fiction is the dirty cop or the lazy cop. As former law enforcement, how do you feel about that when you see this in books and movies and TV? What do you just sort of brush it off as just being drama, or do you take that personally?
Well, if you've been reading the papers, you know all about the Baltimore's gun force, the gun trace task force, and all the crimes they were accused of and all the crimes that they were convicted of, and now most of them are on an extended vacation at Club Fed. But it's I didn't being in the crime lab and being all civilians, I did not see that many, or if any, dirty cops. There were unfortunately a lot of lazy cops who would just do the minimal that they had to do, wouldn't go for that extra mile. And, you know, so, and yeah, that sort of bothered me because, you know, first of all, it was what each member does in police department reflects on all its members. And secondly, if, you know, it's sort of like I spent 4 hours working this scene, collecting all this kind of evidence. And this lazy so-and-so didn't even bother didn't even bother putting any request for examinations. So he essentially wasted my time and the city's time because he didn't follow through. But like I said, personally, I did not see any dirty cops or anything.
Quentin?
I've seen some dirty cops. We've had quite a few actually in DC police. There was a group called the Dirty Dozen. I don't know if you've ever heard of them, the 90s. And what they did was they thought they were meeting with drug dealers. They were actually undercover feds. They thought they were meeting with drug dealers to help them, to escort them to Florida, to with them all this money to buy drugs and then escort them back. But it was all a sting. So there was 12 officers that went down, but they hadn't been on the department that long. They weren't like the old timers I work with. As far as lazy officers, I haven't really seen any lazy officers, but when they did this TV show, The District, set in Washington, DC, starring Greg T. Nelson, they let me see a pilot because I was the department's motion picture and television liaison officer to talk to her for accuracy and that kind of thing. They showed me this pilot, and the way the movies and TV shows do, the department was mostly Black during that time. It still is, but it was like, let's say 75, 80% Black and the rest others, And they would always make it so that on the screen, there were more white people in the department than Black people. And then when they wanted somebody to do something messed up, it would be a Black officer. But the white officers would still look good, even though it was more Black officers than white officers. But for that scene from The District, they showed me this clip. And they showed this woman is supposed to got raped. And she had to run up to a scout car and bang on it and wake up these two sleeping Black police officers. And so what they did was they changed it when I complained. I said, this department is mostly Black, and nobody, both of them not gonna sit there in the car and sleep. And you're making us, you're making it look like if there's gonna be somebody doing something messed up on the department, it's gonna be a Black officer rather than a white officer. Somebody lazy, he's Black. I said, I don't like it. Nobody likes that. And you didn't realize you did that. So they changed it. They made it 2 white officers. But still, we all know that if you're in a scout car with another partner, hey man, I'm tired. You close your eyes for a minute. I got it. I'm listening to the radio. If a guy's had a bad day or been in court all week or had to do something, God knows if you work, let's say you work in 3 p.m. to 11:30 p.m., you make an arrest. Wait, the next day you got to be in court, the paper at 8 o'clock in the morning. And then you go do that, you don't get that much sleep. And next thing you know, you're back at work again for 3 o'clock shift. So, or you have a court case that's ongoing where you get off and you have to be to court and you're in court all day and you come back to your shift working 3 to 11:30. So sometimes that happens. The officer may be sleepy, but his partner's gonna cover for it. Close your eyes for a few minutes, man. I got you. They're not both gonna be in the car asleep. That's all I got to say about that, about laziness. And I did know some crooked cops very briefly. Oh, there was a woman who had a drug dealer for a boyfriend, a police officer. He got murdered. So what she was doing was conspiring with his mother, who was a drug dealer, who had brought her son into the business so they could get the guys who had killed her boyfriend. She was going to get mug pictures from records and find out who homicide was getting close to as far as the suspect, so she could tell the mother and other people to kill the people that killed her boyfriend. And she did her time. She works for Metro Transit now, driving a train.
So it's interesting you bring up that kind of a case. So I want to ask one question. So about 20 years ago, I actually was a juror on a murder case. It was a drug murder, and it was up in the Bronx, and it was a mother and son who were running some coke operation out of their apartment building, and then one dealer wanted to rip off another dealer, and there was a murder gone kind of bad in the apartment, and we all knew on the jury, we're like, this guy he was either there or he pulled the trigger. There's no doubt about this. We all kind of knew this. The problem is the DA did such a terrible job putting on the case. We acquitted him in 2 hours. We could have done it in 5 minutes, but everyone just wanted to talk about it, even though we knew he was guilty. So in your experience, did you ever get to points where, you did the work, you busted your hump, you were out on the street, you collected the evidence, you investigated, you did everything right, and you served up the evidence, and then the DA just didn't do the job? How often was that sort of more of an anomaly? Did that happen, unfortunately, more often than we'd like to think? Bruce?
I wouldn't say it happens more often than you think, but it does happen. I mean, that's the one thing I think that's the hardest thing to learn as a police officer, especially when you're first starting out, is that there is only so much you can control. Your job isn't to be a juror. It's not to be a judge. It's to collect the evidence and do the best you can with reporting and witness statements and all those things, and build a case that will stand up. At the end of the day, there's a lot of people that go between that point where you've made the arrest and built a case and a conviction. And when it comes to murders, which is what we write about, that's the ultimate test. You've got everything is riding on those cases. The stakes are very high. You might even be in a place where capital punishment is on the line. So the attorneys involved are going to be giving their all, regardless of whether it's the prosecutor or the defense attorney. Juries, the whole point of defense attorneys wanting a jury trial is that they can try and play that jury. If they can find that one person on there that has a past, or they can identify with and try to chisel in some doubt, it becomes very difficult to get over that line of beyond a reasonable doubt. So there's definitely a lot to that. There's only so much as the investigator you can control. So you do the best you can, and you follow the rules, and you try to build a case that's not something that can be whittled away.
Right. John, since evidence is your game.
Over my career, I've met with a lot of state's attorneys and defense attorneys. And between the two, I think the defense attorneys have a harder job, at least if you're looking at it morally, because their job is to get this person acquitted, even though everybody seems to know that he did it. They really have to be dedicated. And but like I said, over 40 years, I've run into state's attorneys who to me seemed less than competent, and I've run into defense attorneys who seemed less than competent, and I couldn't help but thinking that had this person been better, the trial could have been different.
Right.
What really bothered me is when certain state's attorneys in pre-trial. First of all, there were certain state's attorneys who couldn't be bothered with pre-trial. Pre-trial conference, and so you got surprised when you were on the stand, which was okay for me after a while because I knew what to expect. But when you got a new person and a state attorney doesn't do a pre-trial conference with them, then you've got a problem. But there was, in pre-trial conference, the state's attorneys kind of they don't want you to lie. No one's ever asked me to lie, but they've wanted me to answer questions in such a way that it helps their case, as opposed to me answering totally objectively.
All right, so guys, so look, so
Excuse me, I got one good
oh,
question about that.
sure.
This is not one of my cases. This was a case of someone I worked with in the crime lab very closely for over the years. And I'm not sure exactly what, but the whole issue of the case involved glass piled up inside a hallway where the glass of the front door had been broken. And this pile of glass did not fit prosecutor's theory of how the crime occurred. The prosecutor basically wanted to say that the glass had been smashed open, and they reached in and unlocked the door, which, I mean, yeah, that could happen, but all the glass was piled up neatly. And he asked the crime lab tech, he said, is there any possibility that the glass could have been broken out and fallen like this? And she thinks for a minute and he said, yes, there is one possibility. He's going, oh yeah, what is it? It's a complete breakdown of the laws of entropy.
All right.
He
Good.
did not call her as a witness.
Right. So, all right. So listen, guys. So we're also talking about crime fiction. So let me ask, and this is a good one. So of all the police movies, TV shows that you over the years, which ones do you feel get it closest to reality? Quentin.
Wow. Yeah, you have to ask me first, huh? Well, I tell you what, the one movie they did everything I told them, they were accurate with the clothing and equipment specifications. That was In the Line of Fire with Clint Eastwood. He's Secret Service agent.
Oh wow!
Out of all the movies I assisted him with, that was the one that came closest to depicting the Metropolitan Police Department as it was at that time.
Wow, Bruce, how about you? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, but as far as realistic police stuff, I don't really know of any that are, as far as, related to my department, to the Metropolitan Police Department of Washington, D.C. The shows that I assisted them with, it's like they didn't listen to me, or it would mess up the drama. So
yeah.
Like people, for example, people always ignore that when a police officer shoots and kills someone, their police powers are revoked. They take away their gun and badge, and then they sit at home with pay until it's determined if the shooting was justifiable or not. You have to sit it before grand jury. But in these movies, I mean, they kill this guy, then they kill this guy. They still got their gun, it's still working. They never lose their weapons, their police powers. They can just go on and on until they get the big bad guy at the end.
Right. Bruce, what about you?
For recent stuff, I'd probably say Bosch. Every once in a while, the actual episode plot might get a little far-fetched, but as far as procedure and that type of thing, they do a pretty nice job with that. And I think that's probably evidence of how much time Michael Conley actually spent with and around the detectives and officers in LA. I'd say what they did was they gave him more than just the company lines. It looks to me like he spent some significant time with them and probably heard some great war stories and maybe went along on some ride-alongs. So for me, the Bosch right now is probably the closest.
John?
Okay. It's not recent times anymore, but the first couple of seasons of Homicide: Life on the Streets was as realistic as it could get because it was actually based on David Simon's book Homicide: A Year on the Killing Streets. And so his book was he rode with the police with the homicide unit for a year. So that was fairly accurate as far as the solving of the crime and the interactions between police officers. Can't remember the whole title, but there was a one-season TV show set in Detroit called, I think, like Detroit 417 or something like that. And it was your typical cop show, but the crime, you'd see the crime scene unit working in the background. And all the equipment they used was equipment that we used. And, they weren't a part of the show, but at least somebody had done their homework as far as what would the crime scene unit really be doing. But the standard joke we had in the police, in the crime lab and in the police department, when asked what are the two most realistic TV shows, well, one was Hill Street Blues and the other one was Barney Miller.
So the show, I think, was Detroit 817. Someone.
Right, that's it.
So what about The Wire? How real was that?
I tried watching The Wire a couple of times, couldn't get into it, and it must have been a little realistic because I stopped watching it because I felt that every time I watched it, I had to put in for overtime.
Okay. All right, guys, that was great. But now it's time for a segment where we're going to spin the wheel. On the wheel are 7 categories, which I created especially for this panel. Wherever it lands is what you get, and that's what we're going to play. All right, John, you're up first. You ready?
Ready, go ahead.
All right, what do we got here? You got, all right, and our categories are, just so you know, we got cold case, life and death, stranger in a strange land, known unknowns, to catch a thief, friend or foe, or rogue one. And you got rogue one, which is the renegade or rogue cop who plays by his or her own rules is another common trope in crime fiction. How real is that?
We in Baltimore City, we've had a few cops who have for whatever reason have taken the law, into their own hands or have conducted unofficial investigations. Most of them wind up being charged, because they've got, they've gone beyond what their job should be. They've jeopardized, by their actions, they've jeopardized cases. I did run into one who decided that despite what everybody told him, he was going to follow this drug dealer until we got evidence against him. He wandered into he was from one police district, he wandered into another police district. Let's just say that given the nature of the neighborhood, he kind of stood out. And not only was he picked up by district officers, he blew a .07 on the breath test. And he was, not only that, he was charged. Conversely, even though he was not on duty and he was doing something he wasn't supposed to, he was then charged with having had alcohol in his system while doing police work.
Okay.
I did manage to get him off of a DUI charge because I pointed out to the internal affairs person that .07 was neither driving under the influence or driving while intoxicated. Damn close, but not it. So he at least dodged that. He did dodge that charge.
All right, Quentin, you're up next. You ready?
Okay.
All right, what do we got? All right, and you got, okay, friend or foe. Okay, well, working in law enforcement, did you ever encounter a criminal or suspect who you liked enough that you thought, if circumstances were different, we could actually be friends?
Well, the answer to that is yes, because a lot of the people I encountered, they were relatives. They were cousins. Yeah, I ended up being the black sheep of the family because we have one part of the family they've been doing crime forever. And when I became a police officer, it was like they ignored me. I didn't make it to anybody. I was never invited to anybody's weddings or anything like that.
Huh.
But yeah, I've answered it as yes, because I had dealings with relatives. See them in the locker. Hey man, can you help me? I said, man, you did this to yourself. You're still doing this stuff. You think I can tell people to let you go or whatever you're accused of? I can't do that. But they were relatives, so yeah, they were friends, but I couldn't help.
Wow. All right, Bruce, you ready?
I am ready.
All right, you're gonna face the wheel. What do we got for you? All right, and you got, okay, life and death. All right, which is, so of all the terrible things, you've seen all the terrible things that people can do to each other. And you mentioned one case before. Other than the case you mentioned earlier, was there a case or did just the composite of it, did it get to you?
Yeah, I mean, really, anything to do with children, I think, is probably the worst that you deal with. I think we all play little mind games with ourselves to get through the job. Sometimes you end up pursuing the person who's responsible for killing a really despicable person. And you have to remind yourself that person still had a mother and a father and family and people that love them. So you do your best to try and capture the person responsible. But I think it's a whole different ball game. You see a lot of things. People are really, we're all capable of doing really dumb things. And I think sometimes that comes from the demons that we house and the habits that we form, and it puts us in unhealthy and bad situations. And, when that happens, things can happen to you that shouldn't be unexpected. But with kids, it's really tough. You really can't play that mind game. There is no reason sometimes. They haven't been around long enough to have enemies or to have really changed anyone's life in a negative way. So for me, those were the hardest ones, I think, every time. Even if it was simply a Sid's death or something along those lines, those were very hard to swallow.
Right. Okay. All right. Thanks, guys. All right. So now we're going to go to our advice columns. So we're all in the business of writing in one form or another. So, Quentin, what's the best and worst writing advice you've ever gotten or heard someone give somebody else?
The best advice? Know your market. Know who you're writing for. If you write crime fiction, don't submit it to some literary magazine. Find out who's got the best magazine out there where the people like to read that. And that way how you gonna go wrong? You have an audience, so you target that audience instead of just writing without knowing who you're writing for.
Okay, Bruce?
Worst writing advice was probably in college, where I was pretty much told that I should find something else to do. The good news is I chose law enforcement, so I actually have something to write about now. But yeah, that's probably the worst advice.
Okay. John?
Okay. The worst advice, and this is a common answer, and that is write what you know, because it sort of implies that if you're in law enforcement, you should only write about law enforcement. As us and Quentin know, you guys write on Arthurian stuff and things like that. It's basically, but I think that should be more, don't write what you don't know. And for instance, if you're going to do a story about Zeppelins, read about Zeppelins before you start writing it. Back when Homicide on the Killing Streets was popular, they got a guy to do a paperback tie-in. And at the beginning, when I was looking through it in the bookstore, the first thing, it was an author's note that he'd never been to Baltimore. He didn't know anything about Baltimore, so the street names and directions were all made up. I did not buy that book. The best advice that I ever got, and this is on a more personal level, was from the late, great C.J. Henderson, who, when he realized that I was a short story writer, told me, write about the same characters. Like, for instance, my character, Matthew Grace. Write about Matthew. If you're going to do a crime story, try to get Matthew Grace in there. And move him, each story should move him a little bit further in his career or his personal progress and all that, so that by the time you have enough stories for a book, you're basically telling one larger story, and that's basically how it's, how it's worked for me. So that's the best advice I've ever gotten.
All right, great advice, guys. So I want to take some questions from the audience. I got a couple good ones. So let's stick on the crime fiction. Bruce, so one question is, what's one of your favorite crime movies?
Oh, favorite crime movie? Just because it just popped into my head, how about Heat? I think what I really love about that movie is that it's pitting two very intelligent and very driven men. And they don't have to be men, they just happen to be in that movie, but they're against each other in a way that it almost becomes a game. It's about ego and ability. And to me, the favorite scene in that movie is De Niro and Pacino sitting down in the diner.
Restaurant, right? Yeah.
And they both know what they're talking about, but they're dancing around the obvious. And I just find that that's kind of a cool concept.
Yeah, that was a great one. Hey, Quentin, how about you?
Well, it's a crime story, but it's not about the police. It's also done by Michael Mann, who did Thief, starring James Gunn.
Oh, I just watched that one recently. That was a great one from the 80s. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was cool. John?
Okay, I'm going to go way back. Two different movies, both based on the same author, The Maltese Falcon and The Thin Man.
Oh, going old school. Okay.
Yep.
Right on. Okay. So another question. So as former law enforcement officers, after you wrote your first books or articles, how did you find people to get published? Oh, how did you, what was your pathway to getting published?
Yeah, as I said, I'm basically a short story writer. I've been writing for about 25 years. I've only just now started writing novels. And I was fortunate to fall in with people like Patrick Thomas and C.J. Henderson and all that, who introduced me to publishers who were willing to take a look at my books and then put them out. And since then, with contributing to anthologies and editing anthologies, I've met other editors and publishers who, again, are willing to put my books out. It's basically been a matter of being fortunate to know the right people who knew the right people.
Quentin, how about you? What was your path?
Well, the first book, I had an agent, and I fired him. And I ended up self-publishing my first book, Sin. But the short stories and all of that, they've been, people like John French, they would ask me, did I have a story to go to a certain themed collection of short stories? And John's been good to me. I'm in like 3 books of short stories he edited. I was in DC Noir with a story that was edited by George Pelicanos. So mainly people will reach out to me and ask me for a short story.
Gotcha.
That's been my path. The Sin was it sold pretty well, but the other stuff, the short stories, more or less people ask me to contribute.
Right.
And I haven't been actually looking to sell any stories, but they ask me to contribute, and I come up with something that goes with the theme of that book.
Bruce, how about you?
Probably the biggest thing for me was being smart enough to take the first novel I wrote and recognize that it didn't do what I needed it to do. It wasn't good enough. I tossed that in the drawer where it belonged, and write a better novel. And that better novel ended up becoming my first published novel. So I'd say it's about, for anyone out there trying to do this, you got to stick with it. If the goal is to get published, and I think we all have that, obviously, or we all had that. The first goal really should be to write well. And if you enjoy the art of writing, and it's not about just getting published, you'll be writing the rest of your life.
Right.
So write better, and at some point, there's always going to need to be some luck involved. But if you stick with it and you want it bad enough, I think that can happen.
All right. So now we're going to do a little shameless promotion here. All right, Quentin, what are we? So this is Sin. What's this about?
That's the first novel. It's it's about a deep undercover operation involving 2 DC police officers. And they infiltrate mid-management of a drug operation in DC. It's set in the mid-1980s. So, and SIN is an acronym for Special Investigations Network.
Okay. Oh, right on. Okay, and and we got one more from you. There we go.
Okay, these two here, Guarding Shakespeare and the Voynich Gambit, they're Norman Blaylock mysteries. The third one I'm working on now, I don't have a title yet, but they're all set in the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. I worked there for 7 years after I retired from the police department. So everything I say about the library is accurate. It's just I take a good story or good stories and overlay them on where I used to work.
All right, right on. All right, so Bruce, what are we looking at?
That's the third book in my series, the Detective Byron Mysteries, and that book is probably the most emotional of the 4 that I've written so far. It starts with a uniformed police officer who's also happens to be the SRO for one of the local high schools, who's taken an overtime job, and in the middle of the night, in the middle of the winter, he ends up chasing 2 suspects from an armed robbery scene, and ends up shooting one of them, and it ends up being a local high school student.
Are these books set in Maine, where you're from?
They are. They're all centered Portland, Maine centered.
All right. So do you have to wrestle for bragging rights with Stephen King?
No, I think he's got me pretty handily, but it's good footsteps to follow in.
All right. And how about this one?
This is the most recent release. This one came out in February. This is John Byron, my main character, trying to deal with newfound sobriety, and he is investigating the horrific murder of a young woman whose body is dumped and staged down near the waterfront. And the case bears striking similarities to several cases from Boston nearby.
All right. Okay, John.
Okay, this is the first volume in the Systema Paradoxa series. Each book will feature a different cryptid, which is a creature who is believed to exist, but for which there is no acceptable scientific proof. You're not really looking at the full cover. The cryptid that's involved in this story, I'm not allowed to reveal who it is until it comes out in the January Cryptid Crate, which features features my book along with some related things like ears and T-shirts and things like that.
All right. Wow.
It's set in, I can tell you, it's set outside my my favorite fictional city, Harbor City, and it's set in the Prohibition era.
All right. And what about this one?
One of the things I remember from watching TV with my father when I was younger was The Saint. And Simon Toombs is essentially my homage to The Saint, except that Simon can do magic. And along the way in the book, it's a collection of short stories, but along the way, he accidentally picks up a killer blonde from hell as his assistant. And a lot of it has, basically the thing that, Simon does is he'll ask you a question, and the answer to that question will basically determine what he does next or what happens to you.
All right. Very good. Okay. Well, thanks, guys. And since we've been talking about cops and crime fiction, if you like a little sci-fi noir in your crime, hot off the press is Crackle and Fire, featuring my hard-boiled intergalactic private eye, Angela Hardwick, who is hired to find a missing intern with stolen corporate files, but soon finds herself tackling with dueling gangsters, hostile protesters, and a madman from Earth with galactic ambitions of his own. Crackle and Fire is available on Amazon and published by Crazy 8 Press. So I want to thank everyone for being here. Thank you, John, Quentin, and Bruce, for a great show. And thanks to everyone who's watching. I'm going to be off for Thanksgiving next week. So happy turkey, everyone. And I'll be back in December with my 2 final shows of the season. Take care, everyone. And
Thank you for inviting us,
Thank you.
Russ.
Thanks, Russ.
All right. Thanks,
Thank you.
guys. Okay.